Rishi Sunak is letting British companies sell millions of pounds worth of weapons to Israel during the conflict in Gaza, despite Foreign Office lawyers secretly advising the government that this trade is illegal. Unlike 5 previous British Prime Ministers who did suspend at least some arms sales to Israel in the face of human rights concerns, Rishi Sunak seems to be ploughing on regardless. This is despite the current conflict in Gaza being the worst by any standard. Israel is under investigation at the International Court of Justice for genocide, and more than 32,000 Palestinians have been killed. Israel's onslaught is continuing despite a UN resolution calling for a ceasefire. British companies exported £42 million worth of weapons to Israel in 2022.
It's not a very significant amount of money.
But since 2008, UK governments have allowed around £500 million worth of weapons to be sold to Israel. These include around 15% of components needed to build the F-35 fighter jet, Israel's most advanced aircraft, which it is using to bomb Gaza. Britain has sold heads-up displays used in the F-16 fighter jet, which has been linked to an airstrike on a compound housing British doctors, which nearly killed them. There are also radar and engine components in the Apache helicopters, which Israel has used, most notably on October 7th, to strafe cars travelling back to Gaza carrying hostages, killing some of its own citizens. And the Foreign Office has been forced to admit in a court case that it has 28 licences for arms sales to Israel that it has classified as high risk, but it hasn't stopped. In the face of overwhelming public pressure and concern, more and more MPs have been asking ministers probing questions about this scandal. Britain's Foreign Secretary, Lord David Cameron, has appeared in front of Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee, chaired by the MP Alicia Kearns. Back in January, he refused to tell her committee whether he'd received any legal advice to stop arms exports to Israel.
So you've never had a piece of paper put in front of you by a Foreign Office lawyer that says that Israel is in breach of its international humanitarian commitments under international humanitarian law?
Look, the reason for not answering this question, I can't recall every single bit of paper that's been put in front of me. So I don't want to answer that question.
But the chair of that committee has now been overheard in a leaked recording talking to a Conservative Party donor.
The Foreign Office has received official legal advice that Israel has broken international humanitarian law, but the government has not announced it. They have not said it, they haven't stopped arms export.
This revelation is likely to infuriate MPs who've already been calling for an arms embargo. A recent letter by the Labour MP Zara Sultana, and signed by over 130 other parliamentarians, called for Britain to stop arming Israel and cited a case in Canada where the government there has recently suspended its own arms sales. There's also a court in the Netherlands which has ordered the Dutch government to stop exporting components manufactured there that are used for Israel's F-35s. Interestingly, in her letter, Zara Sultana mentioned 2 cases where previous UK governments also suspended arms exports to Israel. She cited 2014 and 2009. There are also 3 other cases that Declassified has found where the UK government did the same. This means that 5 British Prime Ministers have stopped arms sales to Israel in the past, something that Rishi Sunak seems completely unwilling to even consider. Let's look then at that first example from 2014. This was actually when David Cameron was Prime Minister of a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. Israel's onslaught on Gaza that year resulted in over 2,000 Palestinians killed. More than 500 of them were children. The Liberal Democrats and Conservative Minister Saeed Avazi pushed hard inside Cabinet for an arms embargo, but it took so long for this to have an effect that by August of that year, Saeed Avazi had resigned in protest. A week later, by which point the fighting had almost finished, Cameron belatedly suspended 12 export licences to Israel. These covered equipment used in tanks, aircraft and military radar systems. In 2009, when Labour's Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, the government had made a similar late decision to suspend arms exports. That was in response to Operation Cast Lead, another indiscriminate shelling of Gaza which killed over 1,400 Palestinians, including around 300 children. At that time, there were 182 arms export licences from the UK to Israel. The government suspended just 5 of them, covering components used in gunboats that the Israeli Navy had used to shell Gaza. Zara Sultana is not the only MP to be pointing out the fact that previous Prime Ministers did suspend arms exports to Israel. It wasn't just David Cameron or Gordon Brown who did it, as Ben Bradshaw recently pointed out.
1982, I think it was, Mrs Thatcher suspended arms sales to Israel. In 2002, Tony Blair did the same. What on earth would it take for this government to follow their example?
Tony Blair made the move during the Second Intifada, when Palestinians were rising up against Israel's illegal occupation. Amid a brutal crackdown, the UK suspended licences for demolition charges, machine guns, rifles, artillery, air-to-surface missiles, armoured vehicles, helicopters and tanks. The embargo was even said to include components for ejection seats made by a company in England that were used on 140 of Israel's F-4 Phantom jets. Margaret Thatcher, who is idolised by Conservatives, herself suspended arms exports to Israel in 1982 in response to Israel's invasion of Lebanon. This embargo lasted, to some degree, until 1994, by which time Margaret Thatcher had been replaced by John Major. Not only did Thatcher's government revoke permission for British companies to sell certain weapons to Israel, but they also pulled an invitation for Israel to attend an arms fair in the UK. The fact that Margaret Thatcher, a founder of Conservative Friends of Israel, whose own constituency, Finchley, is strongly pro-Israel, was willing to take this step shows just how extreme Rishi Sunak's government has become in its refusal to challenge Israel's conduct in Gaza. Looking further back into the 1970s, we see that another Conservative Prime Minister, Edward Heath, suspended arms sales to Israel and Arab nations during the Arab-Israeli War of 1973, when Egyptian and Syrian forces tried to drive Israel out of land that it had illegally occupied in the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. Although the embargo was placed on all sides, it had a particular impact on Israel, which had bought Centurion tanks from Britain and relied on a supply of tank shells, which was then frozen. Heath also went one step further and refused permission for the US to resupply Israel from British bases such as Cyprus. Such a step is hard to imagine today, when the UK government is allowing secret flights in and out of Cyprus to Israel and refusing to disclose what's on board. This also isn't the first time that the UK government has continued to arm a state involved in massive violations of human rights, despite advice from its own lawyers. During Saudi Arabia's horrific bombardment of Yemen, I spoke to a former Foreign Office lawyer, Molly Mulready.
Boris Johnson was very casual and jokey when we would go in to talk to him about arms to Saudi Arabia. It was a bit mind-blowing because it was, you're discussing civilian casualties, you're discussing the fact that innocent people have died and that British-supplied bombs have played a part in that.
Of course, not everyone can become a whistleblower, but many ordinary people are taking direct action themselves. Palestine Action, the campaign group, is shutting down Israeli arms factories in the UK, targeting Israel's largest arms company, Elbit Systems, which makes drones for both the IDF and the British Army. Other groups like Campaign Against the Arms Trade are challenging the UK government's policy in court, and hundreds of thousands of people have been marching against the war. Many of them are likely to support independent candidates at the next election who have promised to run on an anti-genocide slate. If you value the investigative journalism that we do at Declassified, please subscribe to our YouTube channel to help this video reach a wider audience. You can also become a supporter of Declassified from as little as £3 per month. There are details on our website, or you can make a one-off donation using the Super Thanks button below. Thanks for watching.